The palace didn't just crack, it detonated from the inside, and the blast radius had a child's name at the center of it. One video, one voice, and suddenly the most protected family on Earth was scrambling like a dynasty caught with the lights on and the curtains wide open. This wasn't gossip drifting through tabloids. This was a public accusation, launched like a missile straight at the heart of royal legacy, and the shockwaves hit within minutes. Because when Tom Parker Bowles went live and calmly started dissecting the official story surrounding Archie's birth, he didn't shout, he didn't rage, he presented timelines, statements, tiny inconsistencies most people would never think to question. And that quiet, surgical tone made it worse. Viewers weren't watching a rant, they were watching someone peel back layers of a narrative the world had accepted without blinking. Within hours, clips were everywhere, group chats lit up, comment sections turned into digital war zones. Half the internet was screaming that a line had been crossed. The other half was whispering, wait, what if he's onto something? And Meghan? She didn't just get upset. She went nuclear. Legal letters flew out so fast it felt like the printers hadn't even cooled down. Defamation, privacy invasion, emotional harm. Her team came in heavy, demanding retractions, damages, silence. Because from her side, this wasn't public interest. This was someone taking a blowtorch to her child's identity in front of millions. But here's where the story twisted in a way no one expected. Harry said nothing. No statement. No carefully worded show of support. No we stand united moment. The man who had fought newspapers, sued publishers, and publicly battled institutions over his family's privacy vanished into total silence while his son's birth story was being questioned on a global stage. And that silence? It screamed. Inside royal circles, it landed like a thunderclap. Because Harry's pattern had always been predictable. Defend Meghan, shield the kids, push back hard. This time, insiders started whispering words no one wanted to say out loud. Distance, doubt, fracture. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the palace walls were buzzing with a different kind of panic. Not loud, not public. The quiet, controlled kind that happens when a monarchy realizes the storm isn't outside the gates. It's coming from someone with a family name. King Charles was reportedly furious, but not in a simple pick-a-side way. Because from his perspective, this wasn't just a feud. It was reputational shrapnel flying in every direction. A son of the Queen Consort publicly questioning a royal birth. A duchess firing back with lawsuits. A prince missing in action. Optics? Catastrophic. And Camilla, the woman at the center of the emotional backstory, didn't step forward to fight. She stepped back. Sources described her as shaken, not triumphant. Because every time her name gets dragged into conflict, it reopens chapters she spent decades trying to close. The other woman, the villain in Diana's story, the outsider who slowly became Queen Consort. Now, once again, she was caught in a public storm she didn't start and couldn't control. But Tom's video didn't focus on old love triangles. It zoomed in on paperwork, timestamps, media briefings from 2019. He highlighted differences in official statements about when Meghan went into labor, where she was, who knew what and when. Tiny details, presented like puzzle pieces that didn't quite lock together. Then came the moment that sent viewers into full spiral mode. Image metadata. A widely shared photo introducing baby Archie to senior royals allegedly carried a digital timestamp that didn't line up with the public timeline. Tom didn't outright accuse anyone of fabricating anything. He framed it as chronology management. But the implication hung in the air like smoke. Chat feeds exploded. Conspiracy threads reignited. Old rumors people thought had died quietly came crawling back into daylight. And still, Harry said nothing. That vacuum created space for another narrative to grow, one that had nothing to do with documents and everything to do with trust. Because whispers began suggesting that Harry himself had, at times in the past, asked questions about timelines and logistics, not as accusations but as confusion. Those whispers, unconfirmed and swirling, made his present silence feel heavier, more loaded. Back in California, Meghan was described as furious, hurt, blindsided not just by Tom's allegations, but by her husband's refusal to publicly stand beside her in the fire. Their brand had always been unity against the world. Now the world was watching for cracks. Across the ocean, the monarchy faced a nightmare scenario, a legitimacy debate tied, even loosely, to succession. Historically, that's the kind of topic royals avoid like a live wire. But once the question is out, you can't pretend no one heard it. Behind closed doors, advisors reportedly began reviewing procedures, records, protocols, not because guilt had been proven, but because uncertainty itself is dangerous to an institution built on continuity and belief. Public opinion split down the middle. Some saw Meghan as a mother protecting her child from reckless public speculation. Others felt the questions, once raised, deserved answers. Most agreed on one thing: dragging a child into a royal power struggle felt ugly, no matter who was right. And at the center of it all was Archie, a little boy who didn't ask to be a symbol, a headline, or a legal battleground. One live stream had turned private family history into constitutional tension. One lawsuit had forced the monarchy into defensive mode. One silence from Harry had raised more questions than any statement ever could. This was no longer just celebrity drama. It was legacy versus narrative. Protection versus transparency. Loyalty versus truth, or at least competing versions of it. And the scariest part for everyone involved? The story wasn't slowing down. It was just getting started. By the time the dust should have settled, it was only getting thicker, heavier, harder to see through. And that's when the real fear crept in behind palace doors. Because scandals based on bad behavior can be survived. Affairs, arguments, messy interviews, the monarchy has ridden out all of that before. But a scandal based on uncertainty? That's the kind that lingers like a crack in glass, spreading quietly long after the noise fades. Behind closed doors, advisors weren't yelling. They were calculating every possible outcome, every legal angle, every constitutional ripple effect if the public kept pulling at this thread. Because once ordinary people start questioning official royal timelines, it stops being gossip and starts becoming institutional risk. And Harry, the missing piece in the middle of the storm, was reportedly feeling that pressure from both sides. From Meghan, who wanted a united front and a loud defense. And from his past, his bloodline, the family he had publicly broken from, but never fully escaped. Friends described him as torn in a way that went deeper than public image. This wasn't just about headlines. This was about whether the foundation of his own life story felt steady or suddenly shaky. That inner conflict began to show in small telling ways. Fewer appearances, canceled meetings, a noticeable retreat from anything that required a smiling, camera-ready version of himself. The man who once charged headfirst into media wars now looked like someone trying to avoid stepping on emotional landmines he didn't know were there before. Meanwhile, Meghan's strategy hardened. If the palace was going to stay silent, she would make the courtroom speak. Her legal team expanded filings, pushing not just for damages, but for formal recognition that the allegations had caused long-term harm. Not just to her reputation, but to her children's futures. That shift reframed the battle. It wasn't only about whether Tom had crossed a line, it was about whether the monarchy, by refusing to directly shut down speculation, was allowing a cloud to hover over a child indefinitely. And that made things even more uncomfortable for the institution. Because the crown survives on mystique, yes, but also on clarity where it truly counts. Lineage, legitimacy, continuity. The unspoken contract is simple. You don't need to know everything about the royals, but you must believe the basics are solid. Now, social media threads, podcasts, and panel shows were picking apart phrases from 2019 like amateur detectives with royal stationery instead of crime scene tape. Inside Parliament, the mood wasn't dramatic. It was cautious. Quiet inquiries. Legal scholars brushing off old procedural texts. Not because anyone had declared wrongdoing, but because preparation is what governments do when uncertainty touches the line of succession. Even the possibility of future confusion had to be mapped out. William, watching from a different vantage point, reportedly had little patience for the emotional layers of the drama. Where Charles saw family pain and reputational balancing acts, William saw institutional vulnerability. His stance, according to insiders, was blunt. The monarchy cannot afford gray areas in matters that define its very structure. If that meant uncomfortable clarification someday, so be it. Stability first, sentiment second. That philosophical divide between father and heir added another silent tension running beneath the louder one between Sussex and Palace. The next generation was already thinking in terms of repair and prevention, not just damage control. Back in California, the personal side of the crisis deepened. Meghan and Harry had built their post-royal identity on partnership against pressure. But pressure reveals fault lines the spotlight can't hide. Reports of separate schedules, tense conversations, and emotional distance started leaking, not through official channels, but through the subtle language of absence. No joint statements, no coordinated appearances. just two people weathering the same storm from slightly different emotional shelters. And the world noticed. Commentators who once framed them as inseparable began asking whether this was the first scandal that couldn't be solved with shared outrage. Because outrage is easy when the enemy is external. It's harder when the questions feel like they're coming from inside your own history. Still, through all the adult maneuvering, one reality remained deeply uncomfortable. A little boy had become the center of a legitimacy debate he would one day read about. That truth made even some critics uneasy. Public curiosity is one thing. A permanent digital trail of suspicion tied to a child's birth is another. That's why the palace's long game wasn't about winning an argument. It was about containment. Letting legal processes grind forward, avoiding emotional public statements that could escalate things. Trusting that time, procedure, and the public's short attention span might eventually dull the sharpest edges of the story. But this wasn't a normal news cycle scandal. It had all the ingredients to linger: royalty, secrecy, family betrayal, unanswered questions, and just enough ambiguity to keep debates alive for years. Tom had lit the match believing he was defending his mother and challenging what he saw as narrative manipulation. Meghan had responded with the force of someone who felt her child's identity was under attack. Harry stood between those two forces, caught in a crosswind of loyalty, love, and private doubt no one else could fully see. And Charles? He faced the loneliest role of all: monarch, father, husband, symbol, all at once. Trying to hold together an institution built on certainty, while uncertainty dripped steadily into the public sphere. No verdict had been delivered. No official correction had been issued. No explosive proof had surfaced. And yet the damage was already real, not because of what was confirmed, but because of what was now questioned. That's the brutal power of suggestion at the highest level of public life. You don't need to prove the fairy tale is false. You just need enough people wondering if parts of it were edited. In the end, this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision between modern transparency culture and an ancient institution that survives on controlled narratives. One side believes sunlight is the only way to clear suspicion. The other believed too much light can burn the very fabric holding everything together. And somewhere in the middle of that philosophical war stood a family, more fractured than ever, learning the hard way that once private doubts become public spectacle, there is no clean way to put them back in the box. The monarchy had faced revolutions, abdications, and scandals of the heart. Now it was facing something colder. A question mark. A question